Russia has been at war with Ukraine for over 35 months. Today we want to examine the military situation there. I'm Julian Repka, this is BILD's Situation Room. And we're beginning with images from Chernobyl in northern Ukraine. There, in a significant escalation, Russia for the first time attacked the decommissioned yet still radioactive reactor 4 using a kamikaze drone last night. And we're looking at the images, as I said, pretty unbelievable images, because for the first time they show a surveillance camera at night inside the complex, which is partly still active and partly closed. And up here we can see this large structure, which is the new sarcophagus completed in 2019, and it was also constructed and funded collaboratively by the European Union and Ukraine. And now we can see a drone strike in this sarcophagus up here. These are truly astonishing images that one could not have imagined. However, it indeed happened. The outer sarcophagus was struck and even penetrated by this kamikaze drone that Russia deployed in this instance. Now we see the flames coming out of the sarcophagus. Fortunately, and we'll see this shortly, the inner sarcophagus, which was already completed in November '86, not destroyed. Instead, the drone debris then fell several meters further down into the structure. Here we see it inside the facility, having fallen onto the inner sarcophagus, and thus they did not come into direct contact with reactor 4, which will likely continue to emit extreme radiation for another 10,000 years. Here we see the latest images from this morning. Here is the hole in the sarcophagus of reactor 4, and there we clearly see it. And in the end, we'll take another look at what was used here exactly, because of course Russia denies the whole thing and claims it didn't happen. But the images speak a very clear language. Yeah, we have already seen in the shots that a large engine block was lying here, namely the engine block of the deployed kamikaze drone. And here you can clearly see the engine block on the right of a Geran 2 kamikaze drone of the Russian army, formerly the Shahed 136 of the Iranians, which however has been produced by the Russians since 2022, and here we see what was found. And if we take a look at the whole thing and focus on it a bit, we can see quite clearly. It is an identical element we see here. These 4 openings here altogether can be seen, I believe, relatively clearly visible. Several parts broke off because of the impact. For instance, here we can still see the first of these blocks present, but the second is missing. And here we see these 2 blocks side by side, and of course, we also see the propeller on the left side. I hope it's clear that in both cases it has crashed, because this is also a downed or shot down Geran 2. And here we can clearly see the propeller, which is located at the front. Of course, part of it is visibly broken off. Naturally, it continues to spin rapidly when it makes contact with its target. Nevertheless, a very similar damage pattern that we recognize, or not a damage pattern, but at least a picture of the engine. Therefore, there is absolutely no doubt whatsoever that Russia has deliberately targeted a partially still active and partially inactive, yet highly radioactive nuclear facility with one of its total 133 strikes just tonight. Once again, a larger scale attack on Ukraine and its people. In total, 133 kamikaze drones were deployed, and Ukraine also conducted long-range drone attacks last night. However, these were not aimed at a nuclear facility. Instead, they targeted a raw material facility. Here we can observe the impact in the refinery of Slavyansk-na-Kubani, which is a city situated just beyond the Ukrainian border, past the Luhansk region. Now, as we watch, we see how a fire erupted after a Ukrainian long-range drone was deployed against the raw material industry, or the refinery infrastructure has been targeted within the Krasnodar region, causing significant impact. We can also see from where the whole thing was recorded. Nevertheless, we are now moving to Kursk, a bit further north, looking at the current images there as well. And once again, it's the Russian fiber-optically guided precision drones that carried out a new attack. We will now see a US-supplied Bradley infantry fighting vehicle being attacked by the fiber-optically guided drones and ultimately being destroyed. It all happened near Nikolsky, a small village close to Malaya Loknya up north, which is still under Ukrainian control. Nonetheless, here we observe that the Bradley, which is still in motion, is under attack. The initial drone hits it more from the front, thus we see the impact occurring relatively low on it here. However, in the second footage, which comes from the other side, same street and opposite direction, we can clearly see this armored vehicle being attacked again. And now he's not moving anymore. That means we can assume that his mobility, for whatever reason, was already limited by the first hit, or was completely eliminated. So now we can clearly see the approach again here. There's the Bradley trying to take cover near these houses, and then it ends up being destroyed by the second Russian fiber optic guided kamikaze drone. And in the end, we also see footage of the Russian army, namely Nikolsky is now back under Russian control, and we see that the Russians are basically to prove that they thoroughly knocked out the Bradley combat vehicle. Then also released some video footage showing it still standing there after they managed to advance further. Ukraine received a significant number of Bradley vehicles during Biden's term, none from Trump's, and this situation isn't likely to change anytime soon. Nevertheless, a considerable number, likely even a few dozen in various states of damage, have unfortunately ended up in Russian hands. So, it's not exactly a new development that the Russians have captured a Bradley. In fact, they showcased the first ones in Moscow over a year ago already. Let's briefly look at the map on the topic of Kursk and see what happens. As mentioned, Nikolsky is very close to Malaya Loknya, and there we have a relatively dangerous situation now for the Ukrainian army. We see here this red inset, so to speak. So this is the area controlled by Russia. And we can see that you get relatively close here, quite close to both the road and the railway line leading to Malaya Loknya. However, the Ukrainians still maintain control over an area that is about 10 kilometers wide to the east of Malaya Loknya, providing them with a strategic buffer zone. That means even if these connecting roads can now be reached by the Russians, and it looks like it, there would still be an opportunity to secure Malaya Loknya itself and also Pokrovsk, where the Ukrainians are still around supplying the front. From western Russia, we move to eastern Ukraine in the Pokrovsk region, where we have new videos showing us why the Russian army is nearly incapable of striking directly in front of Pokrovsk, why they are left with just soldiers but lack the available vehicles to advance any further. Let's start by examining the videos from the Ukrainian army, which demonstrate in detail how they actually managed to effectively disable almost every vehicle that is deployed and heading in the direction of Pokrovsk. And we've pixelated it now, of course, because we don't show that very often. Of course, each of these vehicles also contains Russian soldiers, and the Ukrainians do not stop at just destroying the vehicles. They then proceed to target the soldiers every time, who are frequently found wounded and lying nearby, and they proceed to go after each one of them again. We see that many of these vehicles are no longer military at all. We just saw the Desert Cross 1003. So we see these Chinese buggies, occasionally some armored personnel carriers, but we also repeatedly see small buses and other civilian vehicles. Even an immediate loader is being utilized here to handle the logistics. This means transporting troops along with essential supplies like food, ammunition, and new weapons in the direction of Pokrovsk, towards the current front line, where the Russians are extremely determined to bring the city of Pokrovsk, which was once home to 65,000 inhabitants, securely under their control. As mentioned earlier, these are quite intense recordings which we continually have to pixelate, since we can see rather clearly that many soldiers are already sitting in those armored personnel carriers, sitting in the buses and trying to move towards the front. Because even there, as we have observed in recent days, the Russians are not really in a good situation. Around Pokrovsk, they even had to retreat at 3 locations. Peshane, Kotlin are 2 of those where they had to pull back a few kilometers because Ukraine was so strong, and because they, unlike the Russians, can still use tanks and infantry vehicles to advance here. With the Russians, as we can see here, there are fewer and fewer. And this is now the Ukrainian perspective we're seeing. That means we have the view of all these, that's the Lada I was talking about, of all these vehicles being destroyed. And now let's take a closer look at the Russian perspective on the same situation. I genuinely find that to be quite revealing. Right here you can see a Russian vehicle that is traveling along that very same road. The weather's a bit different, so it's not the same day. We see burning Russian vehicles everywhere, left and right. Some are still burning, some are no longer burning. But we see that every few meters, by the way, here again a Desert Cross 1003, also a Lada there, that every few meters the vehicles we just saw have been destroyed, and that these are presently lying alongside the road as debris and are lining the street, flanking it to both the left and right sides extensively. The dead Russian soldiers we just saw spread everywhere have likely been removed by now, with efforts made to return them to their homeland in Russia. But in this video, which lasts several minutes, we can see that every few meters on the left and right of the tracks, or this small snowy road that can be seen here, there are Russian tanks, Russian armored personnel carriers, Russian civilian vehicles, and even Chinese buggies. So, exactly the vehicles we just saw. In that sense, it's very telling and also proves that these are by no means propaganda images being spread by the Ukrainians, too, for instance, depict the same attack from different viewpoints or similar methods. However, there are indeed hundreds of vehicles which have just been lined up in front of Pokrovsk in the last 10-20 kilometers, so everything between Avdiivka and Pokrovsk that was destroyed by the Ukrainian army in the last few weeks. And that's why it's extremely difficult for the Russians to reach the front. We're seeing this video, of course, because some vehicles are still making it through. Absolutely clear. We can also see the sky is cloudy here. This means the drones have a tough approach at this time, and that's the situation in Pokrovsk. Let's take a look at the situation on the map. We want to see once again why the Ukrainian army is putting such pressure on the Russians here. Instead of a direct pincer movement on the ground, it's executed from the air. The roads we observed a moment ago led from Selidov heading towards this strategic flanking of Pokrovsk, showing how mobility plays a vital role in their tactics, where they try to flank the city from the west, as mentioned. We also see that the E50 is supposed to be crossed here, the highway to Dnipropetrovsk. And the Ukrainians now have the relatively comfortable situation of being able to threaten with their kamikaze drones from both sides. On one hand from here, from the relatively rural area, and on the other hand also from Pokrovsk. And there are, of course, countless opportunities to hide in the various houses, in the basements, and for the Ukrainians to launch their kamikaze drones from there. That means we also see something like up there in the corner, we see it, those are the 6 kilometers. We know that a Ukrainian kamikaze drone easily has a range of 15 kilometers. And because of this, the entire supply route, particularly the entire last 20 kilometers leading towards the front lines, is being completely monitored and under surveillance by Ukraine. And that's precisely the reason why we're currently seeing a remarkably small number of Russian armored vehicles, as well as other types of vehicles at the front lines. And how precise the Ukrainian drones actually are and how deadly that is for the Russian occupiers we see in the following video. We now see here that an armored personnel carrier has essentially already been destroyed, and underneath this APC, a single Russian soldier is hiding. We can see here that the drone is about to move a bit away. This slightly distorts the video. Nonetheless, we're dealing with a BMP-1 from the Russian army here. And concealed underneath this BMP-1, there's a solitary Russian soldier hiding who is most probably, well, was sent to the front, probably wasn't in there because it's been destroyed for a while and now is trying to find refuge here. Nevertheless, the Ukrainian drone is following him, it's staying close to the ground, which is quite unusual for a pilot. By the way, it's interesting to see that the Russians apparently found that amusing, invading Ukraine and had a smiley face painted on it, which didn't help them either. And we see that the second drone now sees that the Russian is no longer there, but we know he's still sending signs of life. And that's why the drone pilot, you really have to picture this, flies from several kilometers away with an FPV kamikaze drone under the vehicle, spots the Russian soldier here, and directly attacks him under the BMP-1 infantry fighting vehicle. And yes, aside from the fact that it is, of course, a human tragedy we are witnessing here, as another person is dying, it is also the case that over the course of recent months and years, both Ukrainians and Russians have learned such precision as operators of these kamikaze drones that it's almost impossible for the respective enemy, even under just a few centimeters there between the hull of the armored personnel carrier and the snowy ground, to find safety there. Another video focused on the topic of precision and countermeasures against these drones we wish to examine closely. Specifically, it's a video coming from a city that has now been brought under Russian control. We're looking at a relatively tall building, an apartment building, probably in Toretsk. And there we see a very modern jammer from the Russian army. It's only been used for a few weeks. We're going to zoom in a bit closer now, and it's called COP2. According to the Ukrainians, this COP2 is assembled from Chinese components. However, it was not delivered from China but built in Russia, and it's supposed to do exactly what it doesn't do here, namely jam drones. That means it's a big jammer, capable of interfering with a wide range of frequencies from the lowest to the highest, essentially designed to jam Ukrainian drones and thereby take them down from the sky. And the Ukrainians humorously added here that it's supposedly tuned to all frequencies, except for the ones they actually employ. Because we can see here, the approach is relatively clear for the Ukrainian drone. We observe that this advanced high-tech system here doesn't have any noticeable impact at all on the drone's approach. And we'll soon see from a different perspective that there is debris there. Seen from the front, now the side, showing the system was wrecked here. Now I think hopefully you can see it, that's the system. And right up ahead are the debris damages from the explosion caused by the first drone. This means that even this COP2 system of the Russian army, which was actually supposed to intercept the Ukrainians here, has failed, in this case at least. And the Ukrainians are very proud of their technology, their engineering technology, for being able to repeatedly find frequencies that the Russians don't jam. And it's not just against Russian vehicles, Russian soldiers, and Russian jammers that drones are now being utilized, but we also witness yet another video presented by the Magyar group that shows us that artillery systems are also being targeted by these small drones. Here we see it, I hope you can recognize it, that is a barrel, meaning a barrel of an artillery system, in this case a D-30. 122mm system of the Russian army. The drone is now attempting not to cause random damage, but is specifically aiming to create a hole into this barrel. Because the moment there's a hole in the barrel, it can't be used anymore, meaning the entire artillery system can no longer be utilized. because the projectile simply can no longer be correctly fired in the intended direction with the required pressure. We are presently in a position to observe the approach towards this barrel, and now at the end, we are also able to clearly witness the impact event. And the Magyar group repeatedly demonstrates in another video that exactly at this specific point, which you can clearly observe here, right at this spot, destroyed this artillery barrel, rendering that artillery, which cost several €100,000, unusable. So that was the initial impact we observed here, and we'll soon see additional perspectives where each and every time another D-30 gun is targeted by the first drone as it makes its precise approach toward the designated target area, attempting to cause the RPG-7 warhead to detonate in place, and now it's going to be marked once more. We see these tiny holes. These small holes are entirely sufficient that the entire system can no longer be used. That means these small drones, each costing between 500 to 1,000 euros, manage to neutralize artillery systems worth tens of thousands of euros, which were likely transported there at the risk of lives. Here we see the next one. To destroy, disable, and thus make it effectively unusable for any further wartime operations. And naturally, this situation is a very crucial matter for the Ukrainians, as it's not only significantly more cost-effective, but it also demonstrates effectively that they can now counter the Russian artillery systems with their very small drones and get so close, even though they are positioned several kilometers from the front, that Russia, in fact, can largely spare itself from continuing to use artillery here, or at least can deploy these old Soviet large heavy systems only under very significant risk. Finally, let's take a look at Ukraine's airspace. It's still at least partially under Russian control. This means the Russians can fly over many places. They can, as we just saw earlier, fly their drones up to Chernobyl with the kamikaze drones. But also these Salah drones and Supercam drones that are specifically used for reconnaissance purposes are extensively active all over Ukraine. And here we witness yet another episode of the Ukrainian army's skilled air defense. That means we see that small FPV kamikaze drones are being directed very precisely at these large drones. What people in Ukraine are somewhat afraid of is that if the USA withdraws its support now, they might possibly also lose their crucial intelligence capabilities. That means the ability to see from several kilometers away where the Russian reconnaissance drone is moving, when we need to launch our small FPV drone, and how we can intercept the aircraft up there. That means, at present, it requires this very precise coordination between the reconnaissance team, which means you have to be able to see when the Russian drone is in a specific location, and then a unit using these special drones that can fly very high, which can intercept the Russians at an altitude of several kilometers, even in flight height. So on one hand, the Russian drones are defenseless, but on the other hand, the attempt to intercept the enemy drone is just as difficult. It needs precise coordination and also the enemy drone to be destroyed, effectively blinding the enemy in the air. But the main issue is to find out where the Russian drones are located. Of course, the whole system no longer works, and you can no longer defend against this type of surveillance drones. They don't pose an immediate threat by themselves, but they do effectively direct Russian fire. In that respect, we'll need to wait and see what unfolds in the coming days and weeks, whether the USA will really, as partially announced, fully withdraw from Ukraine, and if in that situation, Ukrainian or European engineers will be able to effectively fill this gap.